So let's start right under the config here, the pub trait config, which is the pallet configuration. Let's enter a few times and let's write some code. So the first thing we're going to do is actually do pub struct. So we're creating a public struct or data structure, and we're calling it user info. Now what we're going to do is we're going to define 3 different fields within this data structure. We're going to have a username stored as an array of bytes, and we're going to declare that as username, and it's going to be an array of bytes. Now what happens here is the substrate node actually translates this as a string on the front end, so we don't have to worry about it too much. Just know that this is an array of bytes, which is kind of identical to a string in many ways. Okay, the next field is going to be a number ID for each user. If you've ever used like Discord or something like that, you'll kind of know what I'm getting at here. So number ID of the user, and this will be an integer, 64-bit integer, as you can see. So pub ID : space I64. Finally, the last field will be the about me section. So the about me section of the user, so they can put like whatever description about themselves or whatever. And we just call that pub about _me : and then another vector of bytes because it's just a string. Okay, once that's done, what you want to do is actually copy, and this will be either in the article right after this video or in the Notion templates if you have access to that. There's some macros we need to add in here, and this basically, all you need to know if you haven't used Rust is this makes the struct way easier to work with. This gives us basically the ability to encode it and decode it in different ways and really manipulate the data as much as we want to without any real repercussions. All right, once we have these structs in place, we can move on to creating our storage map. As we kind of went over earlier in the substrate deep dive section, this is going to be directly interacting with the node storage. So we need a way to interact with that storage, and we do that using what's called a storage map. It does pretty much exactly as it's implied. It allows you to create a mapping or a hash map, essentially, whatever key you want to whatever value you want. So let's start defining that. So the first thing is we're going to use a rest macro. So hashtag and then 2 square brackets inside pallets, : and then storage. This means we're basically telling it, hey, we want to use the APIs or interact with the node storage at this point. You're going to add another macro here in the same fashion, hashtag and square brackets, and you're going to actually do pallet getter, and you're going to declare a function in here. And this basically lets us get information from the storage map later on without having to type a whole dedicated function to it. So it makes it super easy. And the function is just called info in this case. Now, finally, let's declare the storage map. So do pub type, and we're going to call it account to user info. And there's going to be angled brackets. We're going to pass in the configuration because we can actually get access to some very useful types when we do this. And these are called generics in Rust. Again, don't worry about it too much. Just follow the syntax and it would work. And go ahead and set all of this equal to the storage map. So storage map right there. And then we're going to configure the storage map now, and it's going to be an underscore. I'll explain all the syntax in just a second, but so far just bear with me. Underscore Blake2 underscore 128 concat. This basically is the hashing algorithm for the keys when it stores in a hash map. We can actually choose different hashing algorithms, but we're going to use this one. And then we're going to access the account ID type via the generic here. So T : account ID, and then we're going to pass in a user info, so comma account ID, and then user info, comma, and then finally the last parameter is option query. And then put a semicolon at the end of those brackets. We're going to format that up. All right. Okay, so what did we just type here? So the first thing we did was we declared a storage map, and then we declared a hashing algorithm we want to use for the storage map. And we want to use the key, which in this case is an account ID, and map this account ID to an instance of user info, so to all this metadata. And then we want it to return an option query, which means that when we query or reach for what's inside of the storage map, it'll either give us none or some value. And this is something also in Rust called an option, which means either it'll give you nothing, and if it's nothing, then we know the user doesn't exist. And if it's something, then it'll give us this data or this instance of this data of user info. And now in theory, when we go to run this in our node, we can actually say, hey, does this account ID have data associated with it? And this will actually tell us via this info function right here whether or not that user exists on the blockchain or not. Okay, and back to events. So we're gonna go ahead inside the curly brackets here, and we're going to declare a new event. And what we want to do is we want to declare whenever a new user has been created. So let's actually do that. Let's go ahead and just type user created, just like this. 2 more curly brackets. And then you can declare the fields of your event within these curly brackets. So in this case, we just want a user, t:::, and then the account ID. The only reason why we're doing this weird syntax here, if you haven't used Rust, is this gives us access to the type config right here, or the trait config, and that has types like account ID within it. So we have to access that via this syntax right here. And we can use this later on inside of our dispatchable function. So for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to leave errors for now. You can mess with them later if you like. Okay, now finally, this is the last step, which is creating our dispatchable function. This actually handles the business logic and things of that nature right here inside the pallet. And the first thing we want to do is we want to copy paste this macro right here. And this will be available, of course, as usual inside the Notion templates or in the next lecture written version of this video. So here you can see this defines the weight of the function. Don't worry too much about this. Just know that this is just part of creating a dispatchable function. Now right below, you want to type pub fn. We're going to call the function register_user. So we're declaring a public function called register user. And we have a few unique arguments when creating a dispatchable function. So let's get those out of the way real quick. Origin for t. So we're passing in actually the config here. I'll explain exactly what this origin parameter is in just a moment, but let's go ahead and pass in some of the other parameters. So actually we want to pass in the username, of course, which is an array of bytes, the ID, which is an integer, and then finally the about me, which is also an array of bytes. Once you're done there, you want to put a dash right after the parentheses dash, arrow, and then you want to put dispatch results. You want to put the dash arrow and then search for dispatch result as the return type right here. And then put 2 curly brackets. Now we're going to get errors at first because it wants us to return something, which is normal. We'll get to that in just a moment. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, we declared a function called register user, which is a public function, meaning that anyone can call it under the pallet's call macro. And then within this function, we have several parameters here. First is the origin. The origin basically passes in all the necessary information on who called this function and basically the origin of whoever called this specific dispatchable function. Next, it's pretty self-explanatory. We pass in the username when we call this function, the ID, and then the about me. And in here, we can actually start writing the logic we need to assign these parameters to whoever called the function or the origin of the function. So first we actually want to get the caller or the sender of this function, whoever called it. We'll do right now. So within these curly brackets, type let sender equal ensure signed. And then pass in the origin right here, and a question mark, and then a semicolon. Now you can see here it says this is actually an account ID, so we actually get an account ID out of this, which we can use to map to user info later in this function. Next, we want to define a new user. So let's actually use these parameters to create a new data structure, user info, right here inside of our pallets function. So let's new user equal to user info, 2 curly brackets, and then you can pass in the username, ID, and about me in that order. And just like that, we successfully utilize our data structure that we just created earlier. Okay, so after we define our sender as such and our user as such, we want to modify the node's inner storage with this specific special call, so 2 angled brackets, and then you want to call our storage mapping, which we called account ID to user info. Yep, account to user info. Inside of here, you want 2 more angled brackets. You want to put T because we're passing the config right here. 2 more colons, insert, and then inside of here, pass in a reference to the sender. So &sign sender, and then pass in also the new user, which is the value. right? And this actually stores it within the node. So now we're storing the sender's key, the account ID, in association to the value, which is the new user. And then the last thing we want to do is we want to emit an event once it's stored that this actually occurred. So to do that, we're going to actually call self : deposit underscore events, and then type events inside the parentheses, : 2 angle brackets, t, and then : again, and then user created, which is the event that we defined earlier. And you can see here it's showing up. And then 2 more curly brackets, user, and the user in this case is the sender. And we put a semicolon at the end of all of that. And then the last thing we want to do is we want to just return OK with 2 parentheses like this. And this will return the function. Basically what happens here in Rust is if something goes wrong, it'll throw the error. Otherwise, it'll just return OK like this. Okay, and just like that, we actually have completed all the business logic for our pallets. We're assigning metadata in association with an account ID to give the account ID more meaning and more value in the long run. Now, if we run and compile this, we'll be able to assign users with information and then also get that information via the blockchain. Okay, congratulations, you just completed your first custom blockchain module or pallets in the Substrate framework.